Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of my lecture on evolution and creationism, this one on creationism, that is the history of the creationist movement, why people say evolution never happened, and what exactly they are arguing. So we'll start this session with the last two slides of the part 1 of this lecture, which was on a little bit of the history of evolutionary theory, and the problem it was trying to solve, which is design, the design problem, the so-called watchmaker argument that William Paley made. That is, if you walk along a path and you see a stone, you don't think much of it. That's just part of the natural world. But if you come across a watch, you don't think that just comes about by natural means. Therefore, there must be a designer behind the design. And until Darwin, and Wallace, there was no explanation. So evolutionary theory, by means of natural selection, provided the explanation for design. And as I showed here, going through the slides, that we accept it as provisionally true because, one, it explains how design happened naturally from the bottom up. Two, it's convergent and independent lines of inquiry all jump to the same conclusion that evolution happened. That's an important argument in the philosophy of science, that is, this consilience of inductions or convergence of evidence from independent lines of inquiry. So it's not like there's some sort of weird conspiracy theory or a conspiracy of sort of unconscious bias driving all scientists to the same conclusion. In fact, these are different scientists working in different fields all coming to this same conclusion, as I showed in part 1 of this lecture. And then 3, it predicts new findings that have been confirmed empirically. So here we are, more than 160 years on since The Origin of Species was published, and the theory has only grown in strength, and our confidence in its validity has gone up after thousands and thousands of experiments. So therefore, we conclude life is designed from the bottom up, not the top down. It's natural design, not intelligent design, and evolution, not creation. So why is it that people can't accept this? Here we are in the starting the third decade of the 21st century, and we still have a strong creationist movement, and at least in America and parts of England. And so historically, it's gone through 4 stages, really the modern creationist movement has. One, banning the teaching of evolution. That's basically from the start of the publication of Origin of Species through the Scopes trial in 1925. That was their strategy, just prevent the theory from being taught. That'll do it. And 2, demanding equal time for Genesis and Darwin when the first strategy failed. Make the equal time argument, which sounds reasonable. And that's from 1957. That's Sputnik and the kind of scare that we're falling behind the Russians in science and technology and engineering and math. So there was a boost in government support for the teaching of evolution as included in part of that package. And they lost those battles, so that led to their third strategy, that is demanding equal time for creation science and evolution science. That is to say, in the second strategy, they're making an argument for the teaching of religion alongside evolution, and that is a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That is, the government cannot favor or support any one particular religion to the exclusion of others. And they lost all those battles all the way up to 1987 with the Louisiana creationism trial that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I'll talk about in detail in just a moment. And then to the present, from 1990 roughly, the intelligent design theory movement, which is a kind of a fancy schmancy modern creationist movement that rejects those first 3 strategies, rejects most of the arguments that young Earth creationists make, and instead has kind of rejiggered the whole theory to sound more sciencey, but still they have failed to win the case in public schools as well as, of course, among scientists. So let's go back to strategy number 1, banning the teaching of evolution. And this culminated in the Scopes so-called monkey trial in 1925. The story is that this young man here, John T. Scopes, was a substitute teacher. from a different county than Dayton, Tennessee, but he had read an advertisement in the local paper in Dayton, Tennessee, taken out by the brand new American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, still going strong today. And they were new. They were looking for some test cases to support the First Amendment, which has always been their cause, and this was one of their first major public events that they supported. And so Scopes volunteered to break the law, which it was at the time, because Tennessee had passed a law forbidding the teaching of Darwin's theory of evolution in public schools. So again, parenthetically, this is a public school issue. If you have your own private school or you homeschool, you can teach the kids whatever you want. We're talking about government schools, essentially. Government-supported schools, taxpayer schools, whatever you want to call them. That puts it in the jurisdiction of the First Amendment protecting religions from being favored, any one religion from being favored by the government. So that's the scope of this, as it were. Anyway, Scopes was a free-thinking young man who thought, well, this could be fun. And so the trial took place in the summer of 1925, so school was off. He did give a lecture on Darwin's theory, and he was arrested. He wasn't really arrested. It was just kind of for show. And the ACLU brought in Clarence Darrow. They had local attorneys who understood the law better, but Darrow was the most famous defense attorney of the era. And on the other side, they brought in William Jennings Bryan, who was a 3-time presidential candidate. If you've never heard of President Bryan, it's because he lost all 3 times. But he was also a very vocal defender of the faith, and also a defender of sort of what we would call a progressive, a far left, somebody who was defending progressive charges, defending the little guy against corporations and big power structures, things like that. It's the kind of thing you would think today a progressive would support evolution, but I'll show you why he rejected it in a moment. And this is from his final statement at the Scopes monkey trial, which he was not allowed to give because he kind of was going to launch into this whole diatribe about the evils of materialist science and how that leads to atheism and how that's corrosive of religion and therefore morality and therefore American values. Think of it that way. But we reprinted his speech in Skeptic because I thought it was important in as much as it reveals what this trial was really about. That is to say, here is his words. The real attack of evolution, it will be seen, is not upon Orthodox Christianity, or even upon Christianity, but upon religion, the most basic fact in man's existence and the most practical thing in life. If taken seriously and made the basis of a philosophy of life, it would eliminate love and carry man back to his struggle of tooth and claw. So that phrase, red in tooth and claw, struggle for tooth and claw, this is not Darwin's phrase, nor was it exactly capturing what he meant by natural selection of a competition of the fittest, the so-called survival of the fittest, which was also not Darwin's phrase. But what Darwin meant is, by fitness, he meant just whatever it takes for you to survive. So it doesn't mean you have to be super strong, fast, big teeth, and so on. You could be small, slow-moving, camouflaged, whatever it takes to survive and get your genes into the next generation. But Bryan glommed onto this idea. And in part, he got this because, and there's Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney for Scopes, and the trial was actually quite the show. It was the biggest, probably the trial of the century until maybe, OJ or something like that. And the conflict, hell in the high school. You can read the little banners here. Bryan's books are being sold here, a little book stall. Hell in the high schools. And here's editorial cartoons. When shall we three meet again? Here is William Jennings Bryan on the left, Clarence Darrow on the right, and the big ape there in the middle. The trial was covered by the most famous journalist of his era, H.L. Mencken, in which he described the proceedings in a very satirical manner. Here he is on William Jennings Bryan. Once he had one leg in the White House, and the nation trembled under his roars. Now he is a tin pot pope in the Coca-Cola belt, and a brother to the forlorn pastors who belabor half-wits in galvanized iron tabernacles behind the railroad yards. It is a tragedy indeed to begin life as a hero and to end it as a buffoon. He goes on about the trial. Let no one mistake it for comedy, farcical though it may be in all its details. It serves notice on the country that Neanderthal man is organizing in these forlorn backwaters of the land, led by a fanatic, rid of sense and devoid of conscience. Tennessee, challenging him too timorously and too late, now sees its courts converted into camp meetings and its Bill of Rights made a mock of by its sworn officers of the law. Oh boy, that's some pretty harsh criticism, and I'm including that not just because it's kind of entertaining, but it leads to one of the outcomes of the conclusion of this trial that I'll get to in a moment. The backstory on William Jennings Bryan is that he read a book that convinced him Darwinism is evil. Again, you would predict that a liberal like Bryan would support the teaching of evolution and Darwinism, but no. He read this book called Headquarters Nights by a biologist named Vernon Kellogg. So Vernon Kellogg, during the First World War, the early years of the Great War, when America was not yet involved and Belgium was neutral, and Germany invaded Belgium to get to France, and Kellogg went to Belgium to support their neutrality there, and meeting and interacting with the intellectuals and other scientists and so on while he was there, it became clear to him that one of the justifications of the war was kind of a social Darwinism, that is, nations are like species competing in this survival of the fittest, this nature red in tooth and claw, this is going to be politics red in tooth and claw, which they saw as a good thing. That is, we're going to weed out the weak members of the species, and sort of a eugenics kind of argument. So Kellogg was disturbed by that. He wrote about this in Headquarters Nights. Bryan read that book, and it influenced the way he thought about Darwinism. That is, it's not just the scientific theory. It's this kind of this basis of eugenics and racism and anti-progressive causes. So that's why he was against this, why he was so passionate about supporting the prosecution of Scopes and defeating the teaching of evolution. Anyway, the evolution trial was opened by a prayer, which, of course, Clarence Darrow objected to. Bryan, look at some of the headlines here. Bryan gets a round of applause upon entering the room. He was a big superstar. Darrow is in shirt and sleeves. Okay, I don't know if you've ever been to Tennessee or anywhere in the South during the summer. This trial is in July. It's not just hot. It is miserably humid, and you could see the photographs. They're miserably hot. They're fans. Everybody's sweating, and the fans going. No air conditioning, of course. And here's a picture of that. Anyway, the climax of the trial, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100 by the judge, Judge Ralston. Now, that sounds like a bad outcome, but in fact, that's what the ACLU wanted. They wanted him to be found guilty so they could appeal the decision and take it to the state Supreme Court, where they were hoping they would uphold it, and then they could appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court to make it a big case. And then once the U.S. Supreme Court votes on something, if they were to win, that would set a precedent for keeping the government out of the decisions of teaching science. That is, keep religion out of it. So that's what they were arguing. The problem was that any fine over $50 legally had to be levied by a jury, not the judge. So on appeal, the Tennessee State Supreme Court threw the case out. Why? Because of the Darrow quotes I read, and much, much more, and worse than that. They were embarrassed. They didn't want the nation looking down upon Tennessee as this backwater of a bunch of Neanderthals. So they threw the case out as kind of a way of silencing the decision there. Here's a little clip from a great film called Inherit the Wind. Now, it's very fictionalized, of course, but some of the script and dialogue is either taken from or inspired by the actual trial transcripts. And so here, Clarence Darrow is grilling William Jennings Bryan on the stand, which he did. He put him on the stand as an expert on the Bible, and then tries to catch him on the literalism. Now, see, this was at a time when biblical literalism was fairly popular and common, and therefore Darrow wants to try to catch him on the day, the so-called 6 days of creation, God rests on the seventh day. Was it an actual 24-hour day? And if you could get him to confess that, maybe not, then it could be an age, and therefore a day could be a metaphor. Anyway, here's that clip from this great film, well worth watching.
That first day, well, what do you think? It was 24 hours long?
The Bible says it was a day.
Well, it was no sun. How do you know how long it was?
The Bible says it was a day.
Well, was it a normal day, a literal day, 24-hour day?
I don't know.
What do you think?
I do not think about things I do not think about.
Do you ever think about things that you do think about? Isn't it possible that it could have been 25 hours? There's no way to measure it, no way to tell. Could it have been 25 hours?
It's possible.
Then you interpret that the first day is recorded in the book of Genesis could have been a day of indeterminate length.
I mean to state that it is not necessarily a 24-hour day.
It could have been 30 hours. Could have been a week. Could have been a month. Could have been a year. Could have been 100 years. Or it could have been 10 million years.
I protest. This is not only irrelevant, immaterial, it is illegal. I demand to know the purpose of Mr. Drummond's examination. What's he trying to do?
I'll tell you what he's trying to do. He wants to destroy everybody's belief in the Bible and in God.
That's not true, and you know it. The Bible is a book. It's a good book, but it is not the only book.
Right. So, anyway, it's a great film, and so let me read you the consequences of this trial. It was quite consequential to the teaching of science for many years to come. This is based on, so I'm reading here from Why People Believe Weird Things. I had a couple chapters, and this is my first book on this subject. And here I'm quoting from a study by Judith Grabner and Peter Miller from 1974, in which they compared high school textbooks before and after the trial. Believing that they had won in the forum of public opinion, the evolutionists of the late 1920s, in fact, lost on their original battleground, teaching of evolution in the high schools, as judged by the context of the average high school biology textbooks, which declined after the Scopes trial. A trial that seems comical in retrospect was really a tragedy in this sense. And then, so matters stood for over 30 years until October 4th, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first orbiting artificial satellite, thereby announcing to America that, unlike political secrets, nature's secrets cannot be concealed. No nation can hold a monopoly on the laws of nature. The Sputnik scare prompted a renaissance in American science education, during which evolution worked its way back into the mainstream of public education. And in 1961, the National Science Foundation, in conjunction with the Biological Science Curriculum Study, outlined a basic program for teaching the theory of evolution and publishing a series of biology books in which the organizing principle was evolution. So that takes us to the next stage here, which is strategy number 2, equal time for Genesis and Darwin. So I'll pick up the story here. The next generation of fundamentalists and biblical literalists responded with a new approach. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, they demanded equal time for the Genesis story in the theory of evolution and insisted that evolution was only a theory, not a fact, and should be designated as such. The flashpoint for this new fire was the 1961 publication of John Whitcomb and Henry Morris's The Genesis Flood, the biblical record and its scientific implications. Here's a copy of the cover, and there's Henry Morris there pictured. Whitcomb and Morris were not interested in the origins of species, as the authors themselves explain. Quote, "The geological record may provide much valuable information concerning Earth history subsequent to the finished creation, but it can give no information as to the processes or sequences employed by God during the creation, since God has plainly said that those processes no longer operate. The book presented classic flood geology in a new light and was promoted by new creationist organizations like the Creation Research Society, founded in 1963. These organizations helped push through creationist legislation. For example, in 1963, the State Senate of Tennessee, there it is again, passed by a vote of 69 to 16 a bill that required all textbooks to carry a disclaimer that any idea about, quote, "the origin and creation of man and his world is not represented to be scientific fact." The Bible, designated as a reference book instead of a textbook, was exempt from the disclaimer. This bill was appealed by the National Association of Biology Teachers on First Amendment arguments. And about the same time, Susan Epperson, I think I have a picture of her here, a high school biology teacher in Little Rock, Arkansas, filed suit against the state on the grounds that an anti-evolution bill passed in 1929 violated her rights to free speech. She won, but the case was overturned by the Arkansas Supreme Court in 1967 and later appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think I have a slide for that. There she is. And continuing, in 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court found Epperson in the right. The court viewed the 1929 Arkansas law as, quote, "an attempt to blot out a particular theory because of its supposed conflict with the biblical account." I have a quote for that. There it is. And interpreted it as an attempt to establish a religious position in a public classroom. On the basis of the Establishment Clause, the Arkansas law was overturned, and the court ruled all such anti-evolution laws unconstitutional. This series of legal contingencies led directly to a third course of action on the part of creationists that we'll go to now. That is round 3, equal time for creation science and evolution science. That is to say, they just added the word science into their title. It's not creationism, it's creation science. And in 1981, Arkansas Act 590 required, quote, "balanced treatment of creation science and evolution science in public schools." Now that sounds reasonable, right? Got to tell both sides of the story. But the constitutionality of Act 590 was challenged by Reverend Bill McLean, as McLean versus Arkansas, in which science, scholarly religion, liberal teachers, and the ACLU were squared off against the Arkansas Board of Education and various creationists and creation organizations. In that case, federal judge William R. Overton of Arkansas ruled against the state on the following grounds. First, he concluded, and by the way, this is the Overton decision is super important. Not only is it quoted in the subsequent trial in Louisiana that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it set precedents for defining what science is in legal terms, and then that influences lots of other cases after that. So this is an important decision here. He argued, first, creation science conveys an inescapable religiosity and is therefore unconstitutional. Quote, "every theologian who testified, including defense witnesses, expressed the opinion that the statement referred to a supernatural creation which was performed by God." Overton then listed 5 essential characteristics of science. So in other words, he's saying they're actually doing religion, not science. And therefore you have to say, well, what is science? Well, okay, here it is. 5 essential characteristics of science. Now, mind you, this is important because philosophers of science will write these massive tomes talking about what is science, the nature of science, what it is, how it works, and they don't agree with each other, and debates go on for decades. So Overton is basically saying, cutting right through that, going, look, we got to cut right to the chase. This is what science is. 1, it's guided by natural law. 2, it has to be explanatory by reference to natural law. 3, it's testable against the empirical world. 4, its conclusions are tentative. And 5, it's falsifiable. Now, I've talked about this before in this course. The idea of falsifiability is Karl Popper's. That is, scientific theories are never proven. Particularly that word proof, like in mathematics, we don't do that in science. Nor do we prove something to be true with a capital T. All these conclusions are provisional, that is tentative, but they have to be testable in some way. You can't just gather evidence to support a theory because, as we now know, the confirmation bias is too powerful. We will always find evidence for our preferred theories. What you have to look for is counter evidence. That is, what would it take for you to change your mind? What would it take to falsify your theory? Okay, so that's the key. Overton concluded creation science fails to meet these essential characteristics. In other words, it's not that they're religious or teaching religion, although that is a violation of the First Amendment, so they lose on that front. But what we're adding here now is that, and they're not doing science, because that's what they were claiming by adding the hyphen science. Okay. This led to the Louisiana creationism case in Edwards versus Aguillard. I like this photograph here from the trial. This is not a science book, the Bible. That pretty much captures the issue here, I think. And in fact, the Supreme Court of the United States voted in this case, academic freedom does not encompass the right of a legislature to structure the public school curriculum in order to advance a particular religious. This led to the Louisiana creationism case in Edwards versus Aguillard. I like this photograph here from the trial. This is not a science book, the Bible. That pretty much captures the issue here, I think. And in fact, the Supreme Court of the United States voted in this case, academic freedom does not encompass the right of a legislature to structure the public school curriculum in order to advance a particular religious. Okay, picking up where we left off here with the SCOTUS case in Louisiana. Again, the vote was 7-2. These are the two dissenting justices, Rehnquist on the right and Scalia on the Rehnquist and Scalia, and this is interesting. Let me pick up the case here as I describe it in my book. This is an interesting exchange between Rehnquist and the ACLU lawyer, a guy named J. Topkis, who wanted to take a minimalist approach and just say, well, but what these creationists are doing is they're just teaching a religion. It's a violation of the First Amendment. But Rehnquist argued that so what? In this instance, however, the argument failed on the ground. Topkis's argument failed on the grounds that if the science were valid, it should have a place in the curriculum of public school science classes, no matter what its relation to religion. The justices' historical analogies brilliantly countered Topkis's arguments. For example, Chief Justice William Rehnquist demonstrated to Topkis that it is possible to believe in the creation of life by God with no religious intent, in which case that would not be a violation of the First Amendment. So here I've put the argument, the conversation between these two on the screen here. So Topkis argues, of course not. Rehnquist, well, then, you could believe in a first cause, an unmoved mover, that may be impersonal and has no obligation of obedience or veneration from men, and in fact doesn't care what's happening to mankind. Topkis had to agree. Right. And believe in creation, Topkis, not when creation means creation by a divine creator. And Rehnquist says, and I ask you, it depends on what you mean by divine. If all you mean is a first cause, an impersonal mover, then Topkis interrupts him. Divine, Your Honor, has connotations beyond I respectfully submit. But Rehnquist interrupts him. But the statute doesn't say divine. Topkis, no. Rehnquist says, all it says is creation. All right, so introduce then the amicus curiae brief, which was organized by Murray Gell-Mann and Stephen Jay Gould. To an amicus curiae brief is a brief that anyone is allowed to submit to the United States Supreme Court justices in an effort to sway their opinions. Now, they don't have to accept everybody's letter, but if you have a a document that's well-researched, well-written, and particularly signed off by famous people. So Gould and Gell-Mann got, I think it was 72 Nobel Prize laureates to sign off on a statement about what science is to explain why what the new creation scientists are doing is not science. So it's kind of a follow-up to the Overton decision. So here is what the scientist argued in this amicus curiae brief. Quote, "Science is devoted to formulating and testing naturalistic explanations for natural phenomenon. It is a process for systematically collecting and recording data about the physical world and then categorizing and studying the collected data in an effort to infer the principles of nature that best explain the observed phenomenon. Next, the scientific method is discussed, beginning with the collection of facts, or the data of the world. The grist for the mill of scientific inquiry is an ever-increasing body of observations that give information about underlying facts. Facts are the properties of natural phenomenon. So here they're distinguishing just the data, not facts as in things that are true, because there are no truths in science in that sense. Continuing, the scientific method involves the rigorous methodological testing and principles that might present a naturalistic explanation for those facts. Continuing, based on well-established facts, testable hypotheses are formed. The process of testing, quote, leads scientists to accord a special dignity to those hypotheses that accumulate substantial observational or experimental support. And this special dignity is called a theory. So here they're really pushing back against this idea that everybody has a theory. You have a theory, I have a theory. When the general public says theory, they mean, wild-ass guess. Just, I have this theory about whatever. Okay, so they're saying, no, in science, it's a very specific meaning here. When a theory explains a large and diverse body of facts, it is considered robust if it consistently predicts new phenomenon that are subsequently observed, then it is considered reliable. So again, we don't prove theories. You just try to falsify them. When they continue to be non-falsified, then it becomes more robust and reliable, and then our confidence can grow in their reliability. An explanatory principle that by its nature cannot be tested is outside the realm of science, which is most religious claims. Thus, science seeks only naturalistic explanations for phenomena. Science is not equipped to evaluate supernatural explanations for our observations. Without passing judgment on the truth or falsity of supernatural explanations, science leaves their consideration to the domain of religious faith. Now, you can kind of sense the influence of Stephen Jay Gould on that last sentence and his NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, which most scientists today, well, I would say scientists are split on whether they accept NOMA or not, thinking that science does have something to say about the supernatural claims. But we'll set that aside for now. The point of this is that these guys, these creation scientists, they're not doing science. So quit calling them creation scientists. So let me see. I have a concluding paragraph to read about that. Okay, the case from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit was argued before the U.S. Supreme Court on December 10th, 1986, and decided June 19th, 1987. The Supreme Court voted 7-2 in favor of the appellees. The court held that, quote, the act is facially invalid as violative of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment because it lacks a clear secular purpose, and that the act impermissibly endorses religion by advancing the religious beliefs that a supernatural being created humankind. So that's it. And in a way, I wrote about this also in Why People Believe Weird Things because it's an interesting study in the sociology of science. That is, scientists are usually pretty divided over a great many issues. They rarely agree on big common ideas about what science is, but in this case, they did. As I write, the Louisiana trial in general, and the amicus brief in particular, had the effect of temporarily galvanizing the scientific community into not only defending science as a way of understanding the world that is different from religion, but defining science as a body of knowledge accumulated through a particular method, the scientific method. Calling the case the single biggest thrill of my practicing career as a lawyer, Lehman, one of the ACLU lawyers, observed that this issue more than anything else crystallizes what it means to be a scientist. The event has significance in the history of science in that it unified a diverse group of individuals perhaps best characterized by their fierce independence. Nobel laureate Arno Penzias said the communality among the Nobel laureates on the creationism case was unusual and that he could not imagine another issue receiving such support. Among the other Nobel Prize-winning signers of the brief were individuals whom Penzias, quote, often had violent arguments on other issues. And then I write here, it would seem that there are two possible explanations for this unity. First, the scientific community felt itself directly under attack from the outside. And as social psychologists have demonstrated, in such conditions, almost any group will respond by circling the wagons. A social psychologist might find this most enlightening instructive study of the process of de-individuation, in which individuals temporarily suppress conflicts within a group in order to defend themselves from a perceived common enemy. As Nobel laureate Val Fitch observed, quote, when scientific method and education are attacked, the laureates close ranks and speak with one voice. Okay, so when I wrote that, so White People Believe Where Things came out in 1997, I thought, well, that's the end of that. Fat chance. Okay, round 4, intelligent design theory arose in the really early 90s, but it really gathered steam in the late 90s and early 2000s. And here is what William Dembski, one of the leaders of the intelligent design movement, wrote in 2003 in his book, The Design Revolution. By the way, InterVarsity Press, his publisher, is not a university press. It's known to be a Christian publishing house. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it's an interesting factoid. He writes, quote, intelligent design is a strictly scientific theory devoid of religious commitments. Whereas the creator underlying scientific creationism conforms to a strict literalist interpretation of the Bible, the designer underlying intelligent design need not even be a deity. Wow, that's interesting because, of course, he doesn't think that. I've met Bill. He's a good guy. I like him. Super smart guy. But, you know, if I said, well, Bill, could it be an alien, an extraterrestrial intelligence of great power that's able to, say, genetically engineer life? You know, do you think that's who the intelligent designer is? No. Okay, who do you think it is? The God of the Bible. Of course. He continues, and this is in another publication, though, and here he's kind of giving away the motive here of the intelligent design movement. Thus, in its relation to Christianity, intelligent design should be viewed as a ground-clearing operation that gets rid of the intellectual rubbish that for generations has kept Christianity from receiving serious consideration. Okay, so here's what's going on here. The creationists have lost all the battles historically, all the way back to Scopes. These guys know, okay, we got to do something different. We're gonna clear out all that garbage and invent a new science here. That's what they're doing. Nevertheless, and so here's Philip Johnson, one of the other founders of the modern intelligent design theory. He calls his movement the wedge. The objective, he said, is to convince people that Darwinism is inherently atheistic, thus shifting the debate from creationism versus evolution to the existence of God versus the non-existence of God. From there, people are introduced to the truth of the Bible, and then the question of sin, and finally, they're introduced to Jesus. There it is. Boom. Their own followers are telling us what they're really up to. They want to drive a wedge into the Constitution that's been separated. They want to knock down the wall separating church and state. And they want to get more people to Jesus to be saved, okay? It's an evangelical movement. They're evangelizing. Philip Johnson said in yet another interview, this isn't really and never has been a debate about science. It's about religion and philosophy. Boom. Okay, there it is. Nevertheless, what are their arguments? Here they are. I can summarize, because I've read all their books and I've debated them. Here's what they argue in short. 1, X looks designed. Whatever it is, could be the beak of the finch. 2, I can't think of how X was designed naturally. 3, therefore, X was designed supernaturally. It's the God of the gaps argument, right? So everything that science explains, fine, we accept that. But what about this one thing over here? If you can't explain that, that's where God stepped in to stir the particles in the universe to create this particular structure. So I counter this with this argument. That is, in Newton's time, there was something like a problem of the plane. That is, all the planets in the solar system lie in a plane, the plane of the ecliptic, except for Pluto, which is slightly off kilter, but it's not a planet anymore, so no problem. And here's what Newton wrote about this. He thought this was so improbable. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. He wrote this in his great work, Principia Mathematica, one of the greatest books of science of all time. I never see creationists quote the great Isaac Newton. He was a deeply religious man and one of the greatest scientists ever. Why don't they quote him? Because we now have an explanation for how solar systems are formed naturally. Okay? Darwin made this argument in a later edition of The Origin of Species, in which he was criticized for killing God and attacking religion, which he wasn't. And so in a later edition, he wrote, I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feeling of anyone. It is satisfactory, as showing how transient such impressions are, to remember that the greatest discovery ever made by man, namely the law of the attraction of gravity, was also attacked by Leibniz as, quote, subversive of natural and inferentially of revealed religion. A celebrated author and divine has written to me that he has gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms as to believe he required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the actions of his laws. In other words, Darwin is arguing, why can't evolution be the way God created the diversity of life, in the same way that divines who accept Newton's theory of gravity just assume, well, gravity is how God makes planets and solar systems. In other words, you just take it all the way back to the laws of nature, and this is kind of a deistic view that, God created the universe and the laws of nature and then stepped back and just lets the thing run, or has to come in occasionally to stir the particles, keep it going, whatever, but that's what's kind of behind this. Darwin's comment here is more strategic. Like, you don't have to give up your religion. Just accept the science because it's true. And I'm not attacking religion. Now, in the part 1 of this lecture, I explained why he felt that way, even though he himself was not a believer. He's an agnostic, not really an atheist. But his wife was deeply religious. So that's in part his motivation, which is, I think, respectable. Anyway, continuing. Okay, here we go. In any case, if you're going to make the intelligent design argument, you have to ask, well, who designed the designer? So here's what I wrote in Why Darwin Matters. If the world is complex and looks intricately designed, and therefore the best inference is that there must be an intelligent designer, by the same logic, we should infer that an intelligent designer must itself have been designed by a superior intelligent designer. And by the same course of reasoning, any designer who can create a superior intelligent designer must itself be a super superior intelligent designer, which itself must have been created by a super duper superior intelligent designer ad infinitum. Okay, that's the problem with that line of reasoning. Nevertheless, here are I'll give you the 3 best arguments here about this. But first, a little clip from the next big court case in the Dover, Pennsylvania trial, in which the state of Pennsylvania had passed one of these sort of equal time laws where you had to put this sticker paragraph in high school biology textbooks, and they wanted their textbook to be taught alongside the regular biology textbooks, and so on and so forth. So this was challenged, of course, by the ACLU and other science education organizations like Eugenie Scott's National Center for Science Education, who advised the attorneys on this case with their scientists who rebuked the arguments. But the main guy here, Michael Behe, who made really the first big God of the Gaps argument of the new intelligent design movement in his book Darwin's Black Box. So here he is on trial from Judgment Day. This is a Nova documentary film on the creationist game. So here's just a couple minutes of him being put on the stand.
Dr. Behe, what is your profession?
I am a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
And you're a biochemist?
That's correct, yes.
How long have you taught at the college level?
For 23 years.
Sir, what is intelligent design?
Intelligent design is a scientific theory that proposes that some aspects of life are best explained as the result of design, and that the strong appearance of design in life is real and not just apparent.
Is intelligent design based on any religious beliefs or convictions?
No, it isn't.
What is it based on?
It is based entirely on observable, empirical, physical evidence from nature, plus logical inferences.
Now, when you use the term design, what do you mean?
Well, I discuss this in my book, Darwin's Black Box, and a short description of design is shown in this quotation from Chapter 9. Quote, "What is design? Design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. When we perceive that parts have been arranged to fulfill a purpose, that's when we infer design." End quote.
Part of the defense strategy would be to show the judge examples of biological systems they claimed were too complex to have evolved by natural selection, and therefore must have been the product of a designer.
Can you give us a biochemical example of design, Dr. Behe?
Yes, that's on the next slide. I think the most visually striking example of design is something called the bacterial flagellum. Now, this is a figure of a bacterial flagellum taken from a textbook, which is widely used in colleges and universities around the country. The bacterial flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. And in order to accomplish that function, it has a number of parts which are ordered to that effect. Now, this part here, which is labeled the filament, is actually the propeller of the bacterial flagellum. The motor is actually a rotary motor. And most people who see this and have the function explained to them quickly realize that these parts are ordered for a purpose and therefore bespeak design.
Under the microscope, bacteria powered by flagella seem almost acrobatic.
Okay, that gives you a good idea of their argument. I will now present their arguments and what's wrong with them. Okay. So there's three main arguments that they make. Irreducible complexity, which is what Behe was just talking about there, and then design inference that you make from irreducibly complex structures, and then finally the fine-tune or anthropic principle. It looks like the universe was designed. Okay, so let's go through these three. So irreducible complexity, Behe himself uses the analogy of a mousetrap and defines irreducible complex structure cannot arise by a gradual process of incremental complexity. All its parts need to be together to work, so it must have been the result of an intelligent designer. And he uses the mousetrap as an example of that. You have to have all the parts: the catch, the spring, the platform, the hammer, the hold down bar. And there's no way to get there from just one part. You can't just have one part and it works fine, and then a second part and it works a little bit better, and so on. He says that you can't have that. In fact, actually, you can have a mousetrap with 4 parts, with 3 parts, with 2 parts, and even one part. This is John MacDonald's rebuttal, in which he says, just because intelligent designers can't figure out how it happened doesn't mean it can't happen. You can actually have a single part there. Okay. And so here I remind you of Leslie Orgel's rule, or just Orgel's rule, that is, evolution is cleverer than you are. That is, just because you can't figure it out doesn't mean it can't be done. That is, trial and error strategies are better than centralized intelligent planning, especially if you have 3.5 billion years to do it. Lots and lots of experiments. Most fail, but a few succeed, and that's why we end up with the structures and life forms we have. But this is actually an old problem. They're calling it a different name. In Darwin's time, he was challenged with what's called the problem of incipient stages, or what good is half a wing? That is, how do you get from no wing to a little stub of a wing to a little thing sticking out of your side of your body, all the way up to a fully functioning aerodynamic structure that can achieve lift? How do you do that? Because none of the stages along the way between the little nub and the fully aerodynamic wing structure are functional, so they can't have been adaptive to the organism. Therefore, they would not have been passed along to the next generation, so it can't happen. Yeah, well, I show you 3 examples here, photographs I took in the Galapagos Islands in one day of just 3 different kinds of birds. Here you have, on the left, the famous blue-footed booby with gigantic wings, and they run along to get some power in order to get some lift, flapping their wings. You have the flightless cormorant, whose name comes from the fact that it can't fly. But its wings are still useful. They're used for thermodynamic regulation. Here he is. They dive underwater, they eat moss off the rocks, and they use the wings to kind of push themselves around and keep themselves underwater. And so it has that function. And then also when they get up, they put the wings out or they pull them in to regulate their body heat. And then, of course, the famous Galapagos penguin, which is tiny. It's only like this big because they evolved up from Antarctica. Anyway, that's a long story. But their wings are used to glide through the water as rudders, as it were, and also push themselves along for propulsion. So it's good here to make a distinction between an adaptation, that is positive characteristic of an organism that increases fitness by natural selection, and exaptation, or exadaptation, sometimes also called a pre-adaptation or a co-option. This is Stephen Jay Gould's word for a character evolved for one function, later used for a different function. For example, feathers initially were used for insulation, thermoregulation, now also used for flight. Okay, so although that's a modern term, exaptation, Darwin countered in his own time with an argument similar to this. So it's an old problem that was solved long ago. One of the most famous papers Steve Gould ever wrote was on spandrels. Spandrels, what does that got to do with it? In architecture, it's a space between 2 arches, like the photograph on the right here. This is not a functional part of the design. That is to say, if you want to have 2 side-by-side arches, you're going to end up with this space here. That space is called a spandrel. So the arches are adaptive, the spandrels are not adaptive. So to ask what was the purpose of the spandrel, there is no purpose. It wasn't designed for anything. It's a byproduct. And that's what they're after in this famous paper that he wrote with Dick Lewontin both at Harvard, called The Spandrels of San Marco, this church in Italy, and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the Adaptationist program. So their critique, the Adaptationist program, is that everything we look at has to have an adaptive purpose as we sit here today looking at it. And if you can't figure it out, it doesn't mean it was designed by God or an intelligent designer. It means it probably had some other purpose sometime in the past, and it was co-opted for some other use later. Panglossian Paradigm is Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's famous novel, in which everything has a purpose. Here's their description. The spaces arise as a necessary byproduct of the fan vaulting. Their appropriate use is a secondary effect. Anyone who tried to argue that the structure exists because the alternation of rows and portcullis makes so much sense in a Tudor chapel would be inviting the same ridicule that Voltaire heaped on Dr. Pangloss. Things cannot be other than they are. Everything is made for the best purpose. Our noses were made to carry spectacles, so we have spectacles. Legs were clearly intended for breeches, and we wear them. Okay, that's, of course, backward reasoning. My favorite example of Steve Martin's invention of this eyeglass nose piece for eyeglasses, as if to say, we have noses so we can hold glasses on our face. Of course, that's backward reasoning, but that's what Gould and Lewontin are arguing that hyper-adaptationists do, and that's a mistake, and it kind of opens the door for creationists to jump in there. Another example is umbilical cord, and of course it has a functional purpose and evolved for one reason, but the belly button, of course, can be used for other purposes as well. So, navel piercings is a kind of spandrel. You might think of it that way, that signals uniqueness and status, say. Gould's favorite example is the panda's thumb. So the panda uses its thumb to strip the leaves off a bamboo, but it doesn't have a thumb. That is, it already has 5 digits. The mammalian radial structure here of the phalanges, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the radial sesamoid bone. It's the wrist bone. So, in other words, the panda's thumb is not beautifully designed for stripping leaves off bamboo shoots. It's a poorly designed thumb, and that's how natural selection works. It works on whatever you happen to have at the time. Okay, the point of this is that much of nature looks kind of quirky like this. It doesn't look like an intelligent designer came down and fine-tuned everything just right. It looks like it was kind of jury-rigged from historical pathways leading to it. And that's, in fact, the case. Now, you saw Behe talking about the irreducible complexity, complex nature of bacterial flagellum. In fact, as Ken Miller showed in his great book, Debunking Intelligent Design Theorists, there is actually more than one kind of bacterial flagellum. There is eubacteria, complex organisms with complicated flagella with a 3-part motor, shaft, and propeller system. And archaeobacteria, simple, with simple flagella, has a motor and a combined shaft propeller system. So when intelligent designers describe the 3-part flagellum as being irreducibly complex, they're wrong. There's a 2-part system. Okay, so that's one argument against them. And in fact, there's 3 functions, not one. So Behe talks about propulsion, but they're also used for secretion, that is, pumping fluids from the interior of the cell to the exterior of the cell through the flagellum, and attachment. They use the flagellum to attach to surfaces and other cells. As well, you can see the evolution, the slow, gradual evolution of the flagellum. 18 to 20 genes for simpler 2-part flagellum, 27 genes for the slightly more complex Campylobacter jejuni flagellum, and 44 genes for still more complicated E. coli flagellum. And so you see a smooth rise in genetic complexity. This is what Darwin would predict, and it's true. So again, bottom-up design by natural selection, not top-down design by a designer. 2, intelligent design inference. So this is a pretty simple example. The famous face on Mars shot by the Viking spacecraft in 1976, which ufologists, of course, went crazy over. The Martians are signaling to us their monumental architecture. In fact, is just an eroded mountain that kind of looks like a face to our brains, okay? But if you saw Mount Rushmore, George Washington here, you would not think erosion, right? It has characteristics of design. So that's the intelligent design inference. You would not infer natural erosion processes. You would infer design. So Dembski's argument here, with he calls the explanatory filter. You start here at the top with something like the structure you're looking at. It could be the eye or DNA or whatever. And you ask, is it highly probable that it would have come about by natural forces? If you answer yes, then that's probably a law of nature. So that's natural. If it's an intermediate probability and you say yes, then that's probably chance at work. But if it's a very specified small probability, like the face of George Washington on the side of a mountain, that has to be design. And this is from Dembski's book, Mere Creation, Science, Faith, and Intelligent Design. Okay. So the problem with, and here he is summarizing the filter. When called to explain an event, object, or structure, we have a decision to make. Are we going to attribute it to necessity, chance, or design? Okay, yeah. Sorry. 1. Does natural law explain the design? I'm quoting here Dembski. If event E has a high probability, accept necessity as an explanation, otherwise move to the next step. 2. Does chance explain the design? If event E has a high probability, or E is not specified, then accept chance. Otherwise move to the next step, of course where he's leading us. Does intelligent design explain the design? Having eliminated necessity and chance, by necessity he means laws, as the explanation for a highly specified but low probability event, accept design. Okay, this is a pretty sophisticated argument, and here's what's wrong with it. 1. The explanatory filter assumes probabilities that cannot be determined in practice. Like, what would be how would you determine the probability of the eye or DNA evolving from RNA or whatever? How do you put a number on that? 2, to eliminate all necessity and chance explanations assume that we know all the configurations of them, and we don't. So, again, it's kind of a God of the gaps argument, because I can't think of how necessity or chance created this particular structure I'm interested in. Therefore, it couldn't have been. Well, maybe you're just not thinking hard enough. Put a little more work into it. 3, intelligent design is not simply the elimination of necessity and chance. Intelligent design is invoking a positive assertion, a claim that some force from on high is reaching in to stir the particles into our universe. I mean, that's different than just eliminating necessity and chance, for which you need to have positive evidence in favor of the existence of a designer, not just negative evidence against the other two options. Okay. 4, apply the explanatory filter to the design's designer. Okay, this is the slide, a couple slides ago I read. If necessity and chance are rejected for the design's designer, then the design's designer had to be designed. Who is that designer? And ad infinitum. And then finally, 5, the ultimate answer to the design inference is to provide a cogent theory of natural design, which we have. It's called the theory of evolution by natural selection. Okay. And finally, 3, the fine-tune anthropic principle. If I had to steelman the the intelligent design theory creationists' best argument, this is it. This is the best one they have. And here they're just quoting scientists. In this case, I'm taking these 6 different. Okay, let's see. Sorry, from Martin Rees. He's what he calls just 6 numbers, which is to say the kind of the fine-tunedness of the universe. The laws of nature are such a way that this structure is here. If they weren't that way, there'd be no structure at all. So they're quoting Martin Rees, who's not a creationist, right? Okay, so omega 1, the amount of matter in the universe, such that if omega was greater than 1, it would have collapsed long ago under gravity. And if omega was less than 1, then no galaxies would have formed, not enough of matter in the universe, just the right amount of matter to get stars, planets, people, and so forth. Epsilon, 0.007, how firmly atomic nuclei bind together, such that if epsilon were 0.006 or 0.008, matter could not exist as it does. 3, the 3 dimensions, the number of dimensions in which we live, such that if the dimensions were 2 or 4, life could not exist. The other 3 numbers, n equals 10 to the 36, or the ratio of the strength of gravity to that of electromagnetism, such that if it had just a few less zeros, the universe would be too young and too small for life to evolve. Q, 1 out of 100,000, that is the fabric of the universe, such that if Q were smaller, the universe would be featureless, and if Q were larger, the universe would be dominated by giant black holes. And finally, lambda, 0.7, the cosmological constant, or anti-gravity force that is causing the universe to expand at an accelerating rate such that if lambda were larger, it would have prevented stars and galaxies from forming. Okay, don't worry about these particular numbers and what they mean in a specific case. The idea here is that the laws of nature are structured in such a way that if you tweak them one way or the other, then we wouldn't be here. And not just you and I, stuff, planets, garages, people, so forth, wouldn't be here. So, and so that is an interesting problem. Then, of course, cosmologists have really good answers to this that I'm going to go over now. But this is the argument they're making. It looks like there was somebody up there tuning the knobs just right. So here's the first argument, that the universe is not so finely tuned. That is, only a few regions of the universe are hospitable to life, and of these few, only for a brief history. I mean, the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Most of the history of the universe is not finely tuned for life. And in fact, due to the accelerating expansion, as billions of years go by, life will have a harder and harder time surviving. So you might say we're in sort of a time chauvinism. and that relates to the second explanation, that is, different physics may not mean that nothing exists. We have only one kind of physics, one kind of life based on this physics. Different universes or different configurations of the laws and constants of our universe could produce some other different kind of life. We are carbon chauvinists, as Carl Sagan liked to say. It's hard for us to think of life based on some other type of physics and chemistry, but that doesn't mean it can't be. Again, it's a kind of a God of the gaps argument. Or sometimes called the argument from personal incredulity, because I can't think of an explanation, therefore there can't be a natural explanation, therefore God. No, that's a fallacy. The next one, unity. That is, there may be an underlying principle behind all the fine-tuned equations and relationships that will be forthcoming when the grand unified theory of physics is discovered. In other words, there won't be 6 mysterious numbers, just one. Okay, there's a lot about physics we still don't know, even though that's the oldest of the sciences and we know a lot. We don't know everything. So before we say there can't be an explanation, therefore God, let's just wait. And finally, this is an argument that I make in Why Darwin Matters. That is, the multiverse idea may just be the next natural step from the Earth as the entire universe, with God outside looking in. That is, the multiverse argument is that there's multiple universes, all of which have different laws of nature, and universes with laws of nature like ours give rise to stars and planets and people that ask, why this universe? Okay, so inevitably, sort of a lottery type argument, somebody's going to win the lottery if you have enough universes, right? So, like, here's the old model of the universe, the old Hebrew model of the earth and the ocean of heavens, where the water comes from the flood, and then above that is where all the stars are, and God's just beyond that. That's a very old idea that was replaced by the Earth-centered solar system as the entire the Earth-centered solar system as the entire universe, to the Sun-centered solar system as the entire universe, to the Milky Way as the entire known universe. And let me just pause on this. This is taken from a book written by Alfred Russel Wallace, who I mentioned in the last lecture, was the co-discoverer of natural selection. When I was writing my biography of him, I was stunned to find this illustration right here from his book, in which he argued that we are alone in the universe. And he actually makes a pretty good argument, but it's based on the idea that the universe is really, really small. It's not big enough to have enough stuff for probabilities to lead to us. It's kind of a probabilistic argument, but his numbers weren't big enough because we just didn't know much. This is barely over a century ago. So the discovery of the age and size of the universe being vastly more than we ever imagined is pretty recent. And that happened in 1923 when Edwin Hubble discovered that fuzzy patch we call Andromeda is not in our galaxy. It's a different galaxy far, far away. And these were the island universes, as he called them. And that takes us all the way up to a steady state universe filled with galaxies, to a Big Bang beginning, accelerating, expanding universe, to the multiverse containing an infinite number of bubble universes, all of which have different laws of nature. So, as I wrote in the concluding paragraphs of Why Darwin Matters, of what we can conclude from all this, science tells us that we are but one among hundreds of millions of species that evolved over the course of 3.5 billion years on one tiny planet, among many orbiting an ordinary star, itself one of possibly billions of solar systems in an ordinary galaxy that contains hundreds of billions of stars, itself located in a cluster of galaxies not so different from millions of other galaxy clusters, themselves whirling away from one another in an accelerating and expanding cosmic bubble universe that very possibly is only one among a near infinite number of bubble universes. To believe that this entire cosmological multiverse was designed and created for one tiny subgroup of a single species on one planet in a lone galaxy in that solitary bubble universe is anthropocentrically blinkered. Instead, science elevates all of us to a higher plane of humanity and humility, that we are in this limited time and space together, a momentary proscenium in the drama of the cosmos. Thank you for listening, and that concludes today's lecture.